Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm so excited about my guest on Beat the Big Guys today. His name is Robert Bilott, but we're going to call him Rob. And he has written a book that got turned into a movie. And both the movie and the book are so important. I highly recommend it. I'm reading the book myself. Robert Bilott is an attorney who took on the chemical giant Dupont and won that battle. Mr. Bilott exposed how scientists at Dupont were concerned about a class of synthetic chemicals called fluorochemicals for at least a quarter century and did nothing. It took Mr. Bilott 20 years to win that battle. Mr. Bilott wrote a book about it, and that book has inspired the major 2019 motion picture with a star-studded cast, including Mark Ruffalo. So welcome, Rob. I'm so excited to have you with me today.
Thanks for having me.
I know you're really busy, and so let's get right to it. And not everybody, not all of my listeners have read your book and seen the movie. So for everyone else out there, please bring us up to speed on why you felt compelled to write your book called Poisoned Water, Corporate Greed, and One Lawyer's 24 Battle Against DuPont.
Well, thanks for inviting me to participate today. I think it's really important to have this kind of discussion because what we're focused on in the book, exposure, that you just referred to, in the movie Dark Waters, in the documentary The Devil We Know, was bringing information out to the public about a class of completely man-made chemicals that are now poisoning literally the entire planet, not just the water, but the soil, living creatures all over the planet, and most concerningly, people all over the planet. And the story really tries to explain, how did this happen? How in the United States during modern times did an environmental catastrophe of this kind of scale and magnitude happen? And how could it happen involving one of the most sophisticated companies on the planet? And with some of our public health regulatory agencies being in place, but yet being misled and being kept in the dark about this information for so long, and what it took for individuals in communities down along the Ohio River, the Mid-Ohio River Valley, to bring that story out to the rest of the world, so that all of us are now learning about not only what happened, but why it happened, and hopefully drawing some important lessons about how we can hopefully fix this going forward, so that something like this never happens again. And what I'm talking about are a class of chemicals called PFAS. You may hear them referred to nowadays as forever chemicals. And PFAS is PFAS. It stands for per and polyfluoroalkylated substances, which is a big mouthful, but it's essentially completely man-made chemicals that are characterized by this unique chemistry of carbons attached to fluorines. And these are chemicals that don't exist on the planet and didn't exist on the planet prior to around World War II, and only now exist because of man. They are completely man-made, made in laboratories, and developed principally by 3M right after World War II. And this is decades before our environmental protection agencies even came into existence. The US EPA wasn't formed until 1970. Some of our first laws and regulations governing how you go about reviewing and approving chemicals before they come out onto the market, those laws didn't come out until the late 1970s. So these were chemicals that were being made and pumped out into the world in massive quantities, decades before some of those laws came into existence, decades before some of these agencies even existed. Yet a lot was known about the toxicity and the dangers of these chemicals. The companies that were making and manufacturing them, again, as I mentioned, 3M, and then one of their main customers, the Dupont company, who was buying one of these chemicals as early as the 1950s and using them to make Teflon. A lot was known by these companies about the toxicity and dangers of these chemicals. And
so
how
about
difficult.
What year are we now when they actually knew that there was a problem with them?
Well,
Approximately.
they started doing a lot of analytical testing, animal studies, lab rats, that kind of thing, in the early 1960s. But a lot was known already at that point about, just from the chemical structure of these chemicals, that if they got out into the environment, they wouldn't break down under natural conditions. They had this weird carbon fluorine bond made them incredibly persistent. If they were out in the environment, it would take them thousands, if not millions of years to break down under natural conditions. That's why they're called forever chemicals, because they simply wouldn't break down. And so, since it was known that these things could get out and stay in the environment, testing began early to find out, well, what are they going to do to living things that are exposed to them? So that's why these laboratory studies began in the early 1960s, looking at what would these chemicals do to living things.
So DuPont in the 1960s wasn't a bad company. They were actually doing good by doing these studies.
Well, you have to remember,
yeah,
I mean, 3M was basically making these chemicals and then selling them. And one of their customers was Dupont. Dupont was buying one of these PFAS chemicals called PFOA. And it's also called C8 because it's got 8 carbons. All of these chemicals, again, have a carbon or fluorine bond. This particular chemical, PFOA, had 8 carbons. So they had nicknamed it C8. Well, Dupont was buying that one chemical from 3M and using it in the manufacture of Teflon down at their manufacturing plant along the Ohio River. And so, since they had been buying this chemical in massive quantities and bringing it to their facility, their own scientists, they had a massive laboratory in-house at Dupont with lots and lots of scientists, even though the agencies weren't even in existence yet. The DuPont scientists, looking at the chemical structure, were concerned about this chemical they were using and started doing these animal studies in the early 1960s and started finding all kinds of toxic effects in the animals. But these chemicals were not used just by DuPont and was not just PFOA. You had a related chemical that 3M made, which was also a C8, had 8 carbons, called PFOS. And that was being used in things like stain-resistant waterproofing materials, Scotchgard, for example, or firefighting foams. So as these chemicals were being developed and put out into the world in the 50s and 1960s and 70s, they started getting used in a massive variety of different products: stain and waterproof clothing, carpeting, carpets, fast food wrappers and packaging, computer chips, firefighting foams, cosmetics, you name it. So by the 70s and 80s, these chemicals were in massive use all over the United States, being put into massive amounts of material, of products. Testing was going on by the companies. Again, 3M and DuPont were looking at the toxicity, and they were finding all kinds of toxic effects in these lab animals. And most disturbingly, by the 1970s, they had found that the chemicals were getting into the blood of humans and were actually building up in human blood. So they knew it was not only toxic, persistent, but also bioaccumulative. It would get into us and it would build up over time. They started monitoring their workers and started seeing that this chemical was getting into worker blood. And so
since this is man-made, the body doesn't know what to do with it.
Correct. The concern is the body doesn't really know how to get rid of this stuff. Unlike a lot of chemicals we're exposed to every day that our body excretes and we get rid of pretty quickly, this stuff our body doesn't really know what to do with, so it stays in us. And these chemicals, unlike a lot of chemicals that might deposit to fat or go to places in the body where they don't do a lot of harm, they're stable. This stuff kind of sticks to the blood and it then circulates throughout our body constantly over time, coating all of our organs. And that's what really got the scientists concerned, starting studying it more and started doing cancer studies. By the early 1980s, the first cancer study had been done with PFOA. And the Dupont scientists looked at the data and said, this is a confirmed animal carcinogen. It causes testicular tumors in the rats. A second study was done showing not only testicular tumors, but liver tumors and pancreatic tumors. So by the 80s, Dupont internally was classifying this chemical as a confirmed animal carcinogen, possible human carcinogen. And they started becoming concerned about, gee, what does this stuff do when it gets out into the local community? Because we're putting it into the air from our manufacturing plant along the Ohio River where we make Teflon. It's going into the water, being discharged into the Ohio River. It's being dumped into pits that are seeping into groundwater. We're a little concerned about whether it's getting out in the environment. So they started sampling and found it was getting into local drinking water in the 1980s.
The 1980s.
Again,
I just want to be clear, like where we are in time here.
Right.
So the fact that the scientists were looking, that's good. It's not like DuPont, was always this big bad giant. It doesn't sound like that to me. It sounds like they got lost. But here, you continue. I'm sure you got more to share for us. Well,
a lot of this information, again, this information I'm referring to about the history and what these chemicals are, this was all internal. This was going on within the companies. Because remember, I mentioned the EPA wasn't even formed until 1970. Some of the first laws governing what you had to report to the agency and what you had to disclose about new chemicals didn't come out until the late 70s. When those laws came out, they really focused on new chemicals from that point forward. So what about existing chemicals like this that were already out there and being used in massive quantities, like PFOA being used to make Teflon? Essentially, the law, and I'm kind of paraphrasing the law here, but the law essentially left it up to the companies that were making or using those chemicals to alert the EPA if there was some risk to human health or the environment, that the agency should go back and look at these existing chemicals. So really, the agencies were relying upon the companies to tell them, is there some chemical out there that's already in use that we should be concerned about? And what we see in these documents is, despite all of this data that was being accumulated by the 1980s, even showing that PFOA could cause cancer, that data was all being kept internal. It was not disclosed or given to the agencies. And the only way we found out about any of this history was when a farmer called me in 1998. I was working at the Taft law firm. I'm an attorney at Taft, Stettinius and Hollister in Cincinnati, Ohio. I've actually now in my 30th year at that law firm. I was about 8 years into my career at that point at Taft when I got a call from a gentleman claiming that he was raising cows on his property outside of Parkersburg, West Virginia, and his cows were dropping dead after drinking white foaming water coming out of a landfill near his property, the landfill owned by Dupont. And he was having trouble getting anybody to respond to him. The local EPA, the federal EPA, the company wasn't giving him any information. He needed somebody to help him figure out what was in that water that was killing his cows. And we took that case on in 1998.
How was he able to reach you?
Well, it was a kind of an interesting connection there. He was actually talking to his neighbor one day who had just happened to have been on the phone with my grandmother. My mom's family grew up outside of Parkersburg. And I spent a lot of time there as a kid. Well, this farmer whose name was Wilbur Tennant was talking to his neighbor, complaining that he can't find anybody to help him, with this issue with his cows. Well, his neighbor had just been on the phone with my grandmother, who was bragging about her grandson being an environmental attorney in Cincinnati. So she provided the name and to Mr. Tennant, and he gave me a call and said, "Hey, I got your name through your grandmother. Can you help us here?" And so hearing that connection, this was not the kind of case we typically handled. At this point, most of the work I was doing was helping represent companies like Dupont. Dupont was not a client, but we represented a lot of big chemical companies. We're doing a lot
goodness. Thank goodness Dupont wasn't your client, and thank
right.
goodness for your grandmother.
Right. So I invited them up, said, bring whatever you have, we'll take a look. And so through that connection, we were able to meet Mr. Tennant, meet his family, and we agreed to take on his case. And it was when we initially filed the lawsuit against Dupont to try to find out what was in this white foaming water, it was through that litigation that we started digging into these internal documents. And at that point, we had never heard of PFOA or C8 or any of these chemicals, had no idea what was in that white foaming water. But it was through that litigation that we found out that this chemical existed, that it was in the white foaming water. And we started digging into these internal studies. And that led to us eventually being able to settle the case for Mr. Tennant when we found out that there were massive quantities of this material in the water the cows were drinking, and he'd never been told. But at that point, when we settled that case for Mr. Tennant,
the end.
It was not the end, because we realized, and Mr. Tennant realized, this went far beyond his property. This was not just a case involving one farm and one family in West Virginia. What we were seeing in these internal documents was that this chemical was not only in the water leaking out of this landfill where massive quantities of this chemical had been disposed of, but this chemical was leaking into the drinking water of the entire surrounding community. And that's where I referenced earlier that Dupont had gone out and actually started sampling the local public water supplies and had found that this chemical was in the public water in both Ohio and West Virginia. And I'd been sampling it for years, but didn't tell anyone about it. Why?
Reprehensible.
Because the chemical wasn't regulated at the time. But one of the concern, but sort of this odd situation, because the reason it wasn't regulated was because the agencies didn't even know it existed. And they didn't know it existed because all of the information about the toxicity of the chemical was being withheld and being kept internal.
It's called loophole. It was a loophole. So they got off, legally through a loophole, but it's nonetheless, it's reprehensible, nonetheless.
Well, when we saw that information and saw that this chemical was toxic, persistent, bioaccumulative, that the company's own scientists had labeled it a confirmed animal carcinogen. And in fact, even though it wasn't regulated, the agencies didn't know about it. The company itself internally had said, well, what's a safe level for this in human drinking water? And had set their own internal guideline, no more than 1 part per billion.
One.
And the levels they were finding were 3 to 5 times that in the public water. But again, weren't telling anybody because it wasn't regulated. So seeing this information, I ended up realizing this is a massive public health threat. So we alerted the federal agencies. Once that information finally got out to the public and to the agencies, the community asked us to help get it out of their water. And that led to a massive class action lawsuit that was filed in 2001 for that entire community. And that's where we got into more documents and more information about what was known about these chemicals. And that case eventually led with providing all this information to not only in the court proceedings, but again, this is a public health threat. So we were providing as much of the internal studies and data as we could also to the US EPA and regulators, saying there's a chemical out there in drinking water all over that has got this massive potential health threat. This needs to be addressed. Drinking water standards need to be set. Well, US EPA ended up actually bringing its own lawsuit against DuPont in 2004, saying information about the toxicity and the fact that this is in drinking water, that was withheld from us. It should have been disclosed. And if it had been disclosed earlier, we might have been able to begin regulating this stuff a long time ago.
And I understand that their evidence, the EPA's evidence, was the evidence that you gave them.
Essentially, that's correct. A lot of these internal studies. So once all of that information started coming out, we were able to settle the case out in West Virginia for the class. We were able to get DuPont had to agree. Under our settlement, we got them to agree to provide clean drinking water through water filtration systems. But we also, importantly, we wanted to set up a system that would confirm once and for all what the health effects were of this chemical. Because what we'd been seeing is there was plenty of data internally that this from the companies themselves showing the chemical posed a serious threat to human health and the environment. Yet the companies were denying that that data meant anything, that there was really any human health threat. So we wanted to have independent scientists confirm for the community whether there was a threat to their health or not. We believe the science showed that there was. Dupont was denying it. So as part of that settlement, we set up an independent panel of scientists who were charged with looking at all of the data, not just what was out there published, because very little had been published, very little had been disclosed publicly, but to look at all the internal studies and to do new studies of that community that had been impacted to confirm whether drinking that chemical could cause harm. And nobody had really done this before. We weren't sure how this would work. We ended up getting 69,000 people in that community who came forward and participated.
Great.
We were able to design, the scientists were able to put together some of the biggest human health studies ever done on any chemical. They spent 7 years doing these studies, studying all of these different health effects. And by 2012, we're able to confirm, frankly, what we'd been seeing in the documents from decades earlier, that the chemical did pose a threat to human health. It could cause 6 different diseases in humans: kidney cancer, testicular cancer. Remember, testicular cancer was shown in that first rat study from the 80s. Thyroid disease, preeclampsia, high cholesterol, and ulcerative colitis. When that data finally came out with the independent scientists confirming those links with disease, the US EPA, for the first time, started requiring public water supplies to go out and start looking for this chemical. And the closely related one I mentioned, PFOS, the 2C8s, that sampling began in 2013 and 2014 all over the US. The chemical started being found in public water supplies all over the US. That data was going into EPA, but not necessarily to the people drinking it, because the chemical still wasn't regulated. Even though when I had started disclosing this data to EPA in 2001, we were asking for drinking water standards. It was now 2016, 2015, and these chemicals still were not being regulated. So part of that process, this very slow process to regulate a chemical in the US, is to make sure, is this chemical one that's even existing in a nationwide basis? So that's why EPA was going out and asking for the sampling to begin, so they could figure out, is the chemical existing on a widespread national basis that would support a national drinking water regulation? So when this data rolled in, it was still an unregulated chemical. So this information is being collected. And what also happened under our settlement is, once those links were established, everybody in that original community down in West Virginia was entitled to medical testing for those 6 diseases going forward. We had thousands of people who then signed up to get free medical testing through the settlement. That's still ongoing to this day. But people who had had one of those 6 diseases, they were now permitted under our settlement to move forward with claims for damages from having gotten one of those diseases, people who got cancer from drinking that. We had 3,500 or so people file those claims. Those all got pulled into a proceeding in federal court in Ohio, where we started bringing those cases to trial beginning in 2015. So through this massive long process, these people are finally going to start to go to trial. We took the first case to trial in 2015 and we won, the lady with kidney cancer. We won the next several trials, including claims with punitive damages that the company had consciously disregarded the risks. So as that data, those trial verdicts are coming out, when DuPont eventually agreed to settle those cases for about $670 million in 2017. Dozens more cases were filed. Those were recently settled for another $83 million. So over $750 million paid to the people in that community.
Wow.
As all this is happening, this data is being collected about this chemical being found in drinking water across the US. An article came out in the New York Times Magazine in 2016, which mentioned for the first time that these chemicals were being found in drinking water supplies all over the US. That triggered people starting to call their local representatives, their senators, their congresspeople, their governors, they all started asking, what's the safe level for this in drinking water? And the demands went into US EPA. What's a safe level? So 4 months later, May of 2016, US EPA came out with its first drinking water guideline for the chemical in drinking water. No more than 70 parts per trillion of PFOA and PFOS combined.
I'm not a math whiz, but that's even less than the one
Very
part per
low.
billion. Okay.
Very low,
That's
because
really
by this
little
point,
bit. Yeah.
yeah, by this point, the concern was not only, this stuff is incredibly toxic. It has been linked now with these human health effects, but it's persistent and it bioaccumulates. So even the tiniest amount can build up over time. So when that guideline came out, then the US Department of Defense realized we've been using these chemicals in firefighting foams for decades outside of military bases. Firehouses have used them, airports have used them. So sampling began on a big scale outside military bases and airports in 2016, 2017. Almost every day from that point forward, some new community somewhere across the US has been finding out that these chemicals are in their drinking water. And then demands have gone in again for what's a safe level. Well, because this regulatory process at the federal level takes so long to get drinking water standards, states started jumping in and saying, we're going to go ahead and start setting our own safe standards. And what we've seen is the levels that they're proposing are going even lower than 70 parts per trillion, 20 parts per trillion, 15, 10. Now we're into single digits. So as that's happened, water providers all over the US have been struggling with now having to put in massively expensive water filtration systems. States are realizing their natural resources are contaminated. Minnesota was the first state in the country that brought a lawsuit against 3M for massive contamination of the state of Minnesota outside the 3M manufacturing plant. The fish, soil, wildlife. They settled that for $850 million. More states have now brought claims. Water providers have brought claims. Hundreds of new lawsuits have been brought based on firefighting foam exposures as well.
Pandora's box has been opened.
Yes. And so now what we're finding out is it's not just these PFOA and PFOS, but as those have started to be phased out, as all this information finally has come out to the scientific community, to regulators, and those two, PFOA and PFOS, are being phased out of production, the companies simply knocked a couple of carbons off. Instead of C8, they're now making something called C6 or C4s. Those chemicals are going out into the world and into the marketplace.
And are they unregulated? Because
they are unregulated.
Because there's C6. So,
correct.
But I understand that you have an idea that you have a plan to do something about this. I understand you filed a lawsuit.
Exactly. One of the concerns we had is, if you step back and look at this, when we first found out about C8, we were told there's no evidence that this presents any risk of human harm. And then we realized there were all these internal studies. There were lots of data that had been done. And then even when we started revealing the internal studies, we were told, yeah, but that's not sufficient. You don't have sufficient data to show it presents a threat to the people drinking it. That's what led to those massive human health studies. Took 7 years. We were able to finally confirm that chemical was linked with human disease, which finally led to its phase out. That was a 20-year process. Well, now that they simply tweaked it a bit and called it something new, we're hearing the same thing we heard 20 years ago.
And are you back to square one, basically?
Well, that's the argument. There's insufficient evidence. You don't have enough evidence to show this new one causes human harm.
So you mean we got to find another farm and more cows have to die and more birds? I mean, is that basically what Dupont's saying?
Well, that's the concern that, are we being told we have to wait and see how many people get sick and die of cancer? Do we have enough? Do we wait another 20 years? So meanwhile, the companies don't do the studies that they claim are necessary to show whether it causes human harm.
My blood is boiling listening to this, and I hope our listeners are too. I mean, it's wrong. The burden is on us, the consumer.
Well,
totally.
Exactly, and that's one of the things I explore in the book, Exposure, is the way our legal system works. The burden is put on the exposed person. if you're exposed to something harmful in the environment, it's basically your burden under the law to come into court and come forward with sufficient evidence to show that that chemical is causing you harm. It's very different. Let's say you've been exposed to something as a drug, something that was regulated by the FDA. There's a lot more required by the manufacturer upfront to prove what's the safe dose in humans upfront. So they have a burden, much more of a burden. But if you're exposed to something that's going to get into you, like PFAS chemicals, that it is known if we put this chemical in the environment, it will end up in people's blood. So it's as if it's being put out there with the knowledge this is going into people, yet the exposure is occurring through the environment and not through a drug. Very different rules apply. And if for environmental exposures, the exposed person is told it's your burden to prove the chemical's harmful to you. And then you're told, in order to prove that, you need massive human studies that require tens of thousands of people that cost hundreds of millions of dollars. How do you meet that burden? That's why this case was so unusual. It was one of the only times that burden was met, that people actually were able to prove that link. So what I'm trying to do now is to say, okay, if the companies are simply going to knock a couple of carbons off or keep putting these out there and say there's not enough evidence to show whether they cause harm, it should be their burden,
right,
to do not to do the studies, but to pay for independent scientists to have whatever studies are necessary to tell us whether they're harmful and what the harms are that are being caused. So we filed a new case in 2018 where we are seeking not money damages, but basically seeking to have an independent panel of scientists appointed by a court who will oversee new nationwide studies looking at not just PFOA in the blood, but PFOA mixed with this bigger group of PFAS chemicals, and to tell us exactly what the risks are. In other words, kind of try to do what we did in West Virginia with PFOA in one community, but do that on a nationwide scale with this bigger group of chemicals. Because if you're going to expose us to these, you should have the burden to pay for whatever science and studies you claim are necessary to tell us whether they're harmful. That's the idea.
And I'm convinced that your book shined a light on this problem, and the movie will shine the light. And the book and the movie and the documentary, those three things will help get the word out there, because once people are aware of this, then they can take steps to take care of themselves, and they can make demands on their government and on their local and their federal government. So, but that the book and this lawsuit, I think, is going to go a long way. So, Rob, I mean, you have shown that an individual can change the world. I know you didn't do it alone. Okay. I know you did. I know you had teams of people working with you. You had your family supporting you. And I know you didn't do it alone, but you led this effort and you've changed the world. And this is, thank you. And thank you for sharing this story. And and we all can change the world. And so there's a couple of things I want to highlight. And you and I share something. When I first started sounding the alarm against the Army Corps of Engineers for the way they killed 1,500 people with their bad levee building, the Army Corps of Engineers at first treated me like I was a friend and a buddy. And they tried being nice to me. And on page 34, I saw Dupont tried to do the same thing with you. Bernie Riley with Dupont. I understand he was a friend of yours or a colleague.
He was Bernie an in-house Riley. Counsel. He was an in-house counsel at Dupont. That
right, but I understand that you knew him.
Yes.
Okay, so he called you and convinced you to hold off right when you were first starting your work defending Mr. Tennant. That he said, let's hold off on discovery. We've got a report coming out any day now, and you were disarmed by his friendliness because this was someone you knew working at Dupont. Do I have that right?
Yeah, we were, I was under the impression that DuPont was, one of the most sophisticated companies and had some of the best lawyers. Bernie Riley, I thought, was, really understood this area really well.
All
So
that goodwill.
if they were working on a report with some of the top scientists at the US EPA, then why wouldn't we wait for that? I mean,
So,
these are the best scientists around.
right. And so, and this, by the way, the same thing happened to me. The Army Corps of Engineers, 200 years of experience, a gold sterling reputation. So the same thing happened to you. It happened to me. 6 months late, 6 months go by and you realize, wait, they never did produce that report. 6 months had gone by. And so anyway, so what this is a tactic that the big guys use. It's called, they come in and they be your friend and they disarm you and then delay. And it happens to all of us. It happened to me. And I just want to point out to our listeners, to be watching for that. Even the best of us can get took by that one, as you and I both were. But I did notice that after Dupont received you call it your 12-pound letter of your intent to file lawsuit, and then you also alerted the government agencies about DuPont's bad behavior, then they weren't nice anymore, were they?
Well, I think one of the first things that happened there was, after we sent that letter, was their attempt to try to go into court and get a gag order, to try to stop us from speaking with public health agencies about a public health threat. And I think it just showed the length to which they were going to go to try to keep this information secret.
Right. And they also started, not only were they not being nice to you anymore, they called you a sleazy, publicity-seeking attorney.
Well, I think
how did that happen?
Yeah, again,
they'll try anything, right?
Yeah, I think they were intent on trying to make sure that this information was kept quiet.
Right. And it sounds like you didn't take it personally, and it sounded like you understood exactly what they were doing, trying to change the subject. But I know our listeners, if you are taking on big guys in your community or your town, be prepared that the moment will come when instead of discussing the issue, they'll go after you. And Rob knows, and I know, it was never about us. The work we were doing, to expose bad behavior, it was never about you. It was never about me. But it's good to keep that in mind as you move forward, because that's a tactic that is all too common among big guys when they have something inconvenient that they don't want to share. So there's a couple of other things. So yes, I had to share something. I had to discuss something else that I noticed in the book on page, let me see, on page 117, you talk some about how, meanwhile, this was a 20-year battle, and this is a period of time where your children were growing up. And it was impossible to take on this huge burden and not have to miss some time with your family. And the same thing happened with my family. But fortunately for people like you and for me, I had a very supportive and understanding family. And it really sounds from reading the book that you did as well.
Absolutely. And I think you see that if you've seen the film Dark Waters as well. I couldn't ask for more supportive wife and family.
And that is just something to be aware of if you decide to take on some really big guys, that it's good to have the support. And also I had the support of friends. So I wanted to ask you, how did it feel when the full gravity hit you of what you knew, and because of all the diligent detail in the reports that you were reading, it suddenly hit you, oh my God, the full gravity hit you. You've got this knowledge. It must have been an awfully heavy burden knowing this. But then also, so you knew this, but meanwhile, you must have been angry. I actually wrote this down. You discuss how angry you were over the ruthless exercise of economic power at the expense of the powerless. So this is all pretty heavy stuff. So do you have anything you can share with our listeners, how you worked through that and were able to remain focused?
Yeah, the whole understanding and awareness of this story really was an evolution over time, just seeing these bits and pieces come together. And, frankly, it was difficult for me to to understand whether I was reading these things accurately. It went against a lot of what I thought going in, and a lot of what I had done up to that point. And so I had to sit down with experts. I had to retain toxicologists and epidemiologists and analytical chemists, to help me read these documents to make sure, am I reading this right? Is what I'm seeing here really what this is saying? And when it finally sort of started to seep in that, yeah, this is as bad as I think it is, and what Mr. Tennant was concerned about, as far as things being covered up, may be accurate here. I had to remain focused on how do we stick to the facts and get these facts out so that this story can be understood, and that the people that can do something about it, not only the court, but the regulators, the scientists, the public, can understand what I'm seeing, and be able to synthesize all this information together in a way that makes sense, and that people can see what I'm seeing here. And that is something that evolved and continued for many years. It wasn't just how do you put this together in a legal brief, but how do you also put this information, which is incredibly complicated, incredibly technical, scientific, legal, how do you put it together in a way that the scientists reading it will understand, the regulators will see the importance, and then the public. We're incredibly fortunate to be able to have the documentary and the film, and then later, with the book as well, to be able to have these different formats to present the information and the story so that people can grasp and see the magnitude of what's going on. And that was an evolutionary process, of we've got to stick to the facts and get the raw data, the raw information out. So it's not just, a lawyer arguing, oh, this is what happened, that people can see the facts for themselves. And, hopefully the facts speak for themselves.
And I think I'm really, really glad you raised that point. At moments where you doubt yourself, and believe me, I went through the same thing. You had to learn a foreign language called, chemistry. My foreign language was civil engineering, and I can now tell you how a levee is built. But what I did and what you did, and I want all our listeners to be sure to hear this, we got experts to help us, okay? Because you aren't a chemist, Rob, and I, Sandy, am not a civil engineer, but I got civil engineers to help me, and you got chemists to help you. So be sure, all your listeners out there, if it's a field that you're not familiar with, just ask for help. You'll be able to get that. You probably can get people pro bono to help you with things like this, especially since you're taking on the big guys, and you might probably, very likely, not being paid for what you're doing. So thank you for bringing up that point about experts. And the last thing I want to mention, though, is something on page 232. You talk about how the EPA finally sued Dupont for their failure for DuPont's failure to report the toxicity of the C8s. And as we discussed earlier in this interview, that most of their evidence was actually the work that you did, that you handed over to them. And then they finally, 5 years later, sued DuPont. But I want everyone to understand that it was that patience. It took 5 years, but it got done. And for all of you out there fighting your big guys, you're not going to win overnight, unfortunately. There may be some cases where you can win overnight, but if it's really big and really important, odds are it won't happen quickly, and you're going to have some patience, and don't give up. And in my book, it took me a decade, actually, to win, to beat the big guys. And in Rob's case, I'll get my guest today, it took 20 to 24 years.
And it's still going on. And I think that's one of the hopefully the important themes and messages people will pick up on, not only through the book exposure, but in the films, Dark Waters and the documentary, is things can change. It can happen. You can take on what appear to be some of the biggest adversaries on the planet, and take on what appear to be most complex laws and legal standards and science, and things can be changed. If somebody like Wilbur Tennant, an individual, a farmer in West Virginia, can stand up, speak out, and look what it's led to. That these things are actually changing. We're getting legislation now being proposed at the federal level, at the state level, at the international level now, addressing these chemicals. And yes, it takes time. It's taken 20 years. The battle is still going on. As you see in the film, where, my character says, still here. These cases are still going on. We are still litigating these issues, yet progress can be made. It's not going to happen overnight. You need to be persistent, as persistent as these chemicals are, and just keep at it, and stick to the facts, stick to the, getting the story out. And I think once you're able to start getting the information out in a way that people can understand the importance and the severity of the issue, change happens. And we're seeing that here. And I think that's one of the powerful things about this story, and particularly in the films, when you see how long it takes, everything everybody's gone through, but the change happens, that things can be done. And it takes one person standing up and speaking out, and not sitting back and assuming, well, somebody else will do this. Somebody else is going to take care of my water. There are agencies that are doing that. Taking personal responsibility. Yeah.
Don't bet on it. Well, that was incredibly uplifting, but I feel like I should ask you just once again, do you have a final word of encouragement for our listeners?
Sure. Again, it's the same theme, that just to realize that change can happen. One person can make a huge difference. If you take anything from the story of Mr. Tennant and the PFAS chemical saga, he didn't even live to see, the end result here. Unfortunately, he and his wife both passed away in the middle of this, but it was their determination, that this story needed to get out. People needed to be aware of this public health threat, that put into motion, what we're now seeing today, which is the world is finally becoming aware of these things. Steps are being taken to protect people. These are things that our children, our babies are being born with these chemicals pre-polluted. So, able to put into motion things that are, happening now on a global scale, international agencies, national agencies, state and local agencies, that are now understanding the issue and are taking steps to fix it. And, that should hopefully be encouraging to folks.
Well, I thank you so much. I feel a little bit better now than I did before we started this interview. The world is a bit better place thanks to you, Robert Bilott, author of Poisoned Water. Thank you for joining me, and I hope all of you enjoyed this episode. Make sure to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast, Beat the Big Guys, on all of your favorite platforms. And remember, no matter who you are, you too can beat the big guys.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rob. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording. Hang on for just 1 second.